Thanks very much. Thanks very much for that warm introduction. Now, if I turn it around the right way. There we go. Perfect. Very good. Well, it's great to be here in Vienna. What I'm going to talk about, I'm going to set out the scene for what we expect to happen in Paris and why it's compelling, it's important that we get the right kind of outcome from policymakers and governments in Paris in December. And I'm quite optimistic that we're going to get the kind of agreement that we need. I'm going to talk a little bit about what is the carbon bubble and why it's important to investors and what it means. Then I'll talk about the divestment movement, and I want to finish talking about technological change and what's really going on and happening in the energy markets. But Carbon Tracker, we're a small not-for-profit organization. Like all good ideas, the idea of it was around drinking a couple of glasses of wine with some friends, maybe 10 years ago, when we just had the first beginnings of what we were thinking about. Well, what was it on my mind, my colleague's mind, was we couldn't understand why the more we knew about climate science and the need to stop burning fossil fuels, why was it that I was working at a big financial institution in London, managing over 100 billion euros in the company, and every time a coal company or an oil company would come through the door, the other fund managers in the room would write them big checks, 50 million euros, and get on and do your projects in the Arctic or wherever it was. And it struck me that you can't burn all this coal, you can't burn all this oil. And so there was the idea of Carbon Tracker. Why don't we just take the world's top 200 companies like Exxon and Shell and these big names you're familiar with, and we'll look at what their plans are, we'll look at where they're developing their new projects, and we'll find out how much carbon dioxide is underground in the reserves that they're developing. Why are they going into the Arctic to find more? And we'll add it all up. And Lottie, who my partner, we ran Carbon Tracker out of our house for the first couple of years. We just saw it as a little germ of an idea. We would just produce a little report, and we'd go home, and we would have satisfied some intellectual curiosity. And we printed, you'll see the report there, where we coined the phrase, the carbon bubble. We printed 100 copies, thinking that, that'd be enough to satisfy people's curiosity, until an American called Naomi Klein gave a copy of the report to another American called Bill McKibben. Now, Bill's been here to speak. No, he came in by video, didn't he? And he wrote this article in Rolling Stone magazine called Climate Change Terrifying New Math, which is on the left there. And if you've not read this article, go and download it. It's just a poetic kind of explanation of the story of what's going on in business and finance and climate. And he took the ideas that we had in it and the simple numbers in it, and he launched the fossil fuel divestment campaign. And so it wasn't possible to just continue with 100 copies of this report. We saw the beginning of launching the organization. And it was actually the members of the Rockefeller family who contacted us first, the great-grandchildren of John D. Rockefeller, and said, well, look, what would you do if you had some money? Could you go and start researching this and doing it in depth? And we said, yeah, sure, we can do that. And I built up a little team of analysts, which is now quite a big team. And the idea was, well, the only way you can really win in the business world and the finance world against these companies, and remember the oil industry and the coal industry, these are some of the most powerful groups of business people in the world. The Koch brothers, we're told in America, will spend $700 million on trying to influence the outcome of the next election. And it's the Koch brothers who, the real central to the fossil fuel industry and challenging the science of climate change. If we can win against those, what we have to do is we have to get the banking system and the investment system behind us. And to win against them, we actually have to get the best analysts who spend their entire careers working for Deutsche Bank or HSBC, using their minds and their research to win against the arguments built by the fossil fuel industry. And so joining me in my team is the ex-global head of oil and gas for a bank in London called HSBC, and we recruited a couple of analysts from Deutsche Bank, including the old head, Mark Fulton, of Deutsche Bank Climate Advisors, who also used to be head of research at Citigroup, and then we took analysts from Barclays Bank as well, and from Jefferies Bank. And this is the team of analysts who are really the ones who produce this kind of research. So the kind of people would say, well, where are the fossil fuels? How much does it cost to develop these new projects? And do we really need all these new projects, which we call our wasted capital report? And then we got into the economics. And so that's a little bit, about my organization. And as I say, I'm very pleased to be here. So I'm going to look into a crystal ball and try and think about the future a little bit. And we heard just earlier that there are some scenarios, really. We've got some choices, some pretty ghastly choices. Either we're going to continue with business as usual, where the congested cities with unbreathable air, we've got this kind of dystopian vision of, I'd like to say it's of the future, but actually it's the current. That could be a city in China or India, which is full of pollution and smog, where if we continue as business as usual and we develop all these oil and coal projects, we'll end up with even worse climate events, whether it's drought, extreme weather events such as floods, and so on and so forth. Or we have another choice. We can actually make the transition now. My message to you today is that the energy transition is happening. Investors are getting out of fossil fuels and moving into renewables. And we'll go into some of the economics of that later on. And we could have this kind of future where the cities that we're building today, the cities that we want to build, with electric cars and electrified trains, that could actually be the alternative. And that's probably what I want us to think about, that there are already dramatic changes happening and beginning to sweep the global energy markets. And going into Paris, what can we expect? Well, we've already got this historic accord with the leading governments of the world signing up to an agreement to limit emissions. And we've got this target of 70% cuts in emissions by 2050. We want to get to net zero carbon. The governments in Paris, 155 nations, and I'm assuming Austria will be one of those countries, will have committed themselves to these things called INDCs, these intentionally nationally determined contributions, where each government agrees to reduce its emissions. That when we add them all up, about 85% of global emissions are covered by this INDCs already, where they commit to decarbonize. So we've got people already along the, oops, have I just turned myself off? How do I turn myself back on? Oh, there we go, we're back on. So sometimes skeptics say, well, what about the Chinese? What about the Americans, the biggest polluters in the world? Well, they've already signed up. So people, people may have had some doubts in the past, but we've already had commitments from the two biggest economies in the world, and faith leaders have brought the voice of civil society, of communities, and the announcement by the Pope, his encyclical that came out just a few months ago, was very quickly followed by the leaders of the other faith communities, including the Muslim community and also the Jewish faith as well. So leaders around the world are raising it in their discourse with their supporters and their membership like faith groups. When I did the report, little did I think that the Bank of England, the governor of the Bank of England, would take an interest. And I arranged a breakfast for Christiana Figueres on Wednesday for Mark Carney, the governor of the bank, where we met with 20 leaders of the financial community in London to listen to Mark Carney. And now Mark Carney, he's the governor of the Bank of England, but more importantly, he chairs something called the Financial Stability Board, which was set up by the G20. And in that group, you have the leaders of all the major central banks. I was asked to present to them as well, and we had the Bundesbank, we had the French central bank, we had the Chinese central banks. And when we have the financial community supporting the faith groups and business leaders and political leaders, I'd like to think with some confidence that we can have a successful outcome as we were looking for in Paris. So let's go back to some basic ideas. So what is the carbon bubble concept? And I hope not to be too complicated, but I do want to get into some climate science. And we heard earlier that we can burn only a limited amount of the fossil fuels. Around 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide can be released of the global warming gases before we go above this 2 degrees warming a ceiling that we've set ourselves. And the thing to note really is that even though it's taken hundreds of thousands of years to accumulate coal underground and oil and create oil from dead biomass, that it was only really in the last 100 years that we decided to release much of the carbon dioxide that's stored underground. It's just a very narrow time period in the Earth's history. So how much carbon are we likely to burn, and how much can we really afford to burn? And I just want to look at those red bars. On the right is a number, it's 2,860 gigatons of carbon dioxide. This is the known reserves of coal, oil, and gas that remain underground. And on the left, you've got different scenarios of how much of that you can burn. And I don't want to use the word safely, because I don't think you can burn more fossil fuels safely. But this roughly is a science of probabilities of avoiding this 2 degrees of warming. Now, 2 degrees is a strange figure. It's a global average rise mean temperature. If the planet was, average mean temperature was 16 degrees Celsius, we're going to increase that by 2 degrees. It's not a 2% increase on previous warming. It's a 2 degrees increase on 16 degrees. So it's quite significant change. And we've not seen concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as we see today for over 400,000 years. It's very dramatic. And to avoid this 2 degrees of warming, we've said, well, the IPCC said, well, we can release 1,100 gigatons. Carbon tracker, to have an 80% probability of avoiding it, around 975. Now, that's another way of saying that if you get into a car with this kind of probability, 50% of the time you would crash it if you were driving it. You really wouldn't want to choose those odds if you were a driver, but those are the odds that we're going to choose if we don't deal with climate change. Is we're really kind of hoping that we're not going to go back to that rather kind of gloomy picture of the future. But based on current emissions trajectories, this is what the scientists are telling us, that if we continue with what's called business as usual. Now, what is business as usual? Business as usual is people continue to use fossil fuels in the same way. Now, if you read the reports produced by Shell and Exxon, and we do, they think the world's going to continue on what they call the business as usual path, growing use of fossil fuels. And if we continue with that, well, we're going to go through that orange path with this huge increase, 5.4 degrees Celsius of warming. Or alternatively, we'll go down this green path, which is what I hope will show that we can do. So going back to carbon trackers analysis, what do we discover? This is the map that was taken from Carbon Tracker's first report, and all those little bubbles, what they actually represent are stock markets. New York Stock Exchange, the Beijing Stock Exchange, the London Stock Exchange, and on each stock market, we added up how much coal, oil, and gas is owned by the companies listed there, and then we try to show it on a relative basis. There's really 3 countries that count. Russia, because of Gazprom and Rosneft. New York, because of Chevron and Exxon, and what was, well, Peabody Coal, what's left of Peabody Coal, and then London, that one right in the middle. So the other way of thinking of the climate problem is it's a financial markets problem, it's a capital markets problem. People own these companies, we own these companies. And as we dug into the plans of these oil companies and these coal companies, what we can see is that if they develop them, we're going to release an awful lot of carbon dioxide. And now, why do we call it a carbon bubble? And we call it a carbon bubble is that, well, we know governments own 70-80% of reserves, you know, Kazakhstan and Iran and those kinds of governments, Saudi. So we've allocated a share of this, what we call the carbon budget, to the oil companies like Shell and BP. And we've given them a 225 gigaton share of carbon dioxide. This is kind of hopefully straightforward maths. When we take the reserves, which is the stuff which is proven, what they say they're more likely to get out of the ground, that's 762 gigatons. Now, each year, the oil companies are spending hundreds of billions in finding new oil and gas, which is part of the cycle. They make money and they reinvest it. I mean, some of them are facing challenges in doing that now. If we're to look at all their projected plans over the next 20 to 30 years, what they plan to develop is 1,500 gigatons of carbon dioxide. Why is it a bubble? Well, because that big red circle doesn't fit inside the green circle. That's why we call it a bubble. Why is it a financial problem? Is this goes right to the heart of the business models of these oil giants and these coal giants. They cannot develop what they're telling us they plan to develop. This is the challenge that we have to face and address ourselves. But unfortunately, one thing that we don't have is time is against us. So when I meet some of these bankers, they'll tell me, well, you're a young man, Mark. Well, I don't think I'm a young man, actually. I'm in my 50s. Does that count? We don't have to worry about this for another 50 years. This is the next generation's problem. And they use this phrase, IBG, YBG, which stands for I'll be gone, you'll be gone. The ultimate get-out clause. And they say, we don't have to worry about this, but let's have a look at those emissions trajectories. And I want to show you actually what happens is that if emissions continue on their current trajectories, we'll burst through this 2 degrees budget in 2031. Now, my maths isn't great, but that tells me really that's only about 15 years away. And then we're likely to go through 3 degrees. And that's if we continue with this path somewhere around 2045. So when are the decisions made about these new projects? Many of these oil projects will take 10, 15 years of gestation before they really get going. Actually, those decisions are being made today. Why is it so important that policymakers and central bankers and investment managers and citizens who invest, well, you only need to have a policy with an insurance company to have an influence on that insurance company, is the decisions are being made today. They're not being made in 10 years' time, they're not being made in 15 years' time, they're being made today. And time is against us. Time is against us. And unfortunately, that compels us to action. So what are the oil companies saying? And this actually, I've taken this from a newspaper article. There's a paper in the United Kingdom called the Daily Telegraph. It's the newspaper of the Conservative Party, if you know the English system. And one of their journalists actually compared the targets that we're setting ourselves for Paris with what the oil companies are saying they're going to do. So, I said it earlier, 155 countries have submitted plans that cover 88% of CO2 emissions, including China and India, and they commit the world to reduction in fossil fuel demand by 30 to 40% over the next 20 years, which is great. That's great. So what is Shell telling its shareholders? And there's going to be Austrian institutions that own Shell and BP. What is Shell telling their shareholders? Well, Shell is forecasting a 43% growth in demand for their products. BP is projecting 43%. Exxon expects 35% increase. And OPEC, you know, the oil, is expecting demand for oil is going to grow by 55%. Now, I know my maths isn't great, but this is a fundamental contradiction. How can you grow the use of fossil fuels by 50% and reduce emissions by 30%? Something's going to have to give. Something's going to have to give. And this is the central problem of the industry. And last week, Carbon Tracker, we launched a new report called Lost in Transition, how the energy sector is missing potential demand destruction. What we think will happen is this demand will not come through. It's a challenge to the business model of these companies. And even Goldman Sachs, which is no hippie bank, was telling its clients that around $1 trillion of what they called zombie investments were going to be made by the oil industry into new projects where they're just not going to make any money. I want to come into that because one of the questions people ask us at Carbon Tracker is how do you allocate a carbon budget effectively? So I don't want to kind of baffle you with too much with graphs, but I just want to point out a few things. What we did is we analyzed every single major coal, oil, and gas project anywhere in the world. And if you work as an analyst, you'll be familiar with something called the Rystad Energy Database or something called the Wood Mackenzie databases. These are databases which the oil industry use and Goldman Sachs use and we use. And these lines are just simply slices of thousands of projects around the world. And what we're looking at is how much does it cost to produce a barrel of oil. Some places, you know, like Saudi, it only costs $5, $6, $7, $8 a barrel to find your oil. If you're going into the Arctic, it's going to cost you $120 to find your oil. And you can actually model and plot all those break-even prices against a curve. Along the bottom is something you don't normally see in the financial literature, is you see cumulative carbon dioxide production. So all the way up to 700 gigatons. And on the left, you've got break-even prices for oil. So what we calculated is that you can allocate certain projects to a 2-degree budget, which is where those red lines are, which is around 360 gigatons of carbon dioxide. And then you can see all these projects which the oil companies are planning to develop using your money. And you can see they're all plotted all the way up. And there are some projects, can you believe this? What's the price of oil today? It's around $50 a barrel, $45, $50 a barrel. There are oil companies planning to develop oil where they only make money when oil gets to $180 a barrel. And they're trying to convince Wall Street to finance them to do these projects. And this is why the economics of the sector, which is really the second point I want to make, is being fundamentally challenged. Again, I don't want to baffle you with some graphs, but this is the number work that Carbon Tracker is kind of best known for. On the bottom left, these are price bands for, if you're running a business, you want to work out how much it costs for you to get your product out of the ground, and you can put it in price bands, $0 to $60 a barrel, all the way above to above $150 a barrel. And then we worked out who's got the cheap oil. That's an important question to ask in the kind of geopolitics of the industry. On the right is OPEC. Now, what you can see from OPEC, what you see is a big grey bar. What that tells you is that the Saudis and the Iraqis and the Iranians own all the world's really cheap oil, okay? In the middle are the companies that you're likely to have in your pension fund, and one of the things I want you to notice from it is all these private companies like Exxon and BP and Shell, the ones that, listed on the stock market that will be in your pension fund, that own all the world's most expensive oil. So if you want to ask yourself the question, who's going to produce that last barrel of oil before we finally stop burning fossil fuels, it's going to be a government, it's not going to be a company. And so if you're an investor, you've got yourself some problems. This is actually the Goldman Sachs report, and it's annotated by Bloomberg, and this is when, remember I showed you that graph of all these different projects. Here you've got the names of the projects on the same shaped graph. And what they've said, oh my God, zombies, all these projects on the right. This is why the oil industry has lost a third of its value. And here's one of the other secrets of the industry, that just in the last year, the big five global oil companies have borrowed $20 billion to pay the dividends that have gone back to the pension funds, which is in excess of the money they've actually earned. So the oil companies, we're told you've got to have these big oil companies in your fund because they're the ones that are going to pay your dividend that's going to keep you safe in your retirement. But they're not paying it from profits. They're actually borrowing it from the bank, which is creating some real stability problems in the banking system. And actually, oil's gone down to $50 a barrel. And what you can see, that red bar, you can shift that red bar on almost another halfway across, which is the crisis of the industry. So why is the industry in crisis? All that easy to find oil's gone. We burnt it in the 70s and 80s and 90s. It's gone. We're having to go to dangerous places like the Arctic. And we're having to go into the really dirty kinds of oil, like the Canadians are trying to develop with their oil sands. Or Petrobras having to go right under the subsalt, hundreds of meters under sea to find the oil. But the one which is probably famous is the Kashagan project. The big oil companies have spent $50 billion trying to develop that project. They've not developed a single barrel already. And it's just an example of how complicated and difficult exploring for oil has got. In fact, Kashagan in the city of London is not known as Kashagan. It's referred to as Cash All Gone because of how much damage it's created to the people who put the money up. There's another way of looking at this. And I guess there's going to be some business people in the audience, and some of these are going to be very familiar with you. These are the three oil companies, the big ones, Exxon, Shell, and Chevron. The orange is how much are they spending on trying to find more oil. And what you'll notice is that in each case is going through the roof, which reflects, the point I made earlier about how expensive it's becoming. And you would have thought you spend more on trying to develop it, your production's going to go up. And actually, what should really be doing is that blue line should be above the orange line. Where is it? It's flat. This is the problem at the heart of the business model of these oil companies. So we have an industry in kind of crisis. So in the next sort of 10 minutes before I wind up, I want to make a few more points about what we need to do. So how do we deal with this problem? We actually have to decarbonize the whole economy, whether it's reducing emissions from buildings or from transportation or in the home. We have to really face this challenge. But we have to contract this industry who wants to expand. We've got to get rid of the next phase of all these projects that they're planning. We have to divest ourselves of these next new projects. And we actually have to plan for what we're going to call an orderly transition. We don't want people to lose money. We don't want people to lose jobs. There is enough time for an orderly, safe transition, a safe landing, but only if we start now. And the divestment movement, which has been growing in size, has been one of the things that's triggered that. So it was Justin Bieber's 18th birthday you got on the front page of Rolling Stone. And it was that article that I referred to earlier, Bill McKibben's terrifying new maths article that led to this extraordinary movement. I was in Zurich just a couple of days ago visiting the divestment campaigners there, and I was in Amsterdam earlier in the year with the divestment campaigners there. And right across the United States, across the campuses of America, across the campuses of France, of Australia, and hopefully probably in Austria too, the students have been campaigning to get the endowments of their universities to divest from coal and oil. And groups like the British Medical Association, they passed a resolution at their annual meetings to tell their own medical associations and the endowments at the hospitals to get off fossil fuels. The same with the World Council of Churches and, of course, the Rockefellers. I was in New York, and for the day when the Rockefellers announced that they were going to divest from fossil fuels. And it was said if John D. Rockefeller was alive today, he wouldn't be investing in oil, he'd be investing in solar. And we're going to see a kind of a picture of what happened in New York the same day of a carbon bubble, hopefully a little bit later. And this is from the Financial Times in London, and the numbers are taken from Carbon Tracker. And BlackRock, which if you're in banking, you're an investment, you'll know is one of the world's biggest investment institutions, have themselves launched a new fund range that divests itself from fossil fuels as well. So who's divesting? So, of course, it's citizens, but it's also foundations, big endowments, big church groups, and of course pension funds. So the Norwegian government pension scheme has divested itself of coal. The Swedish pension scheme system, even in the Netherlands, have been announcing they're divesting. And it's not just pension funds, it's big insurance companies. There's one called AXA, which has announced it's selling 500 million euros of coal, and then educational institutions. But if there is anything that simplifies and sort of explains the narrative, and I'll show you a bit of a video, it was this. When we coined the phrase, Nick Robbins and I coined the phrase the carbon bubble, we didn't think that we would see the carbon bubble being burst on the horns of the Merrill Lynch bull down Wall Street, which just goes to sort of the persistency of the campaigners. So what I want to do now as I finish is talk about technological transformation. What you hear from the oil companies and the coal companies is we need coal, we need oil. We're always going to be using oil. Now, we may be using oil for lubrication oils, and we need it for petrochemicals and in plastics, which is where we really should be using it. I think people in 200 years' time would say, did we really burn all the oil instead of using something constructive with it, like pharmaceuticals and chemicals? And we say, well, you know, we decided to set fire to the stuff. But technological change, history tells us a few lessons. You know, what was the previous oil industry? How did we light our homes? It was actually lit by whale oil, the whale oil. Now, thankfully, the end of the oil industry didn't come from people running out of whales, thank God. It came because burning whale oil in lamps was replaced by kerosene and by the discovery of in the US, of petroleum. But that saw, you know, a major industry change. And the other technological change, the motor car, the internal combustion engine, we're told, well, you know, all these solar companies, all these little renewable energy companies, they won't survive. But history, there's a pattern to this. You get extraordinary innovation. You get lots of little cars, which is what happened at the turn of the last century, were created. You know, General Motors wasn't really established until 1908. And you saw this big burst of hundreds of companies trying to develop a car. And then slowly, the marginal ones would disappear, and you then get this other big white line shows the use and take-up of the motor vehicle in the States. And there's a funny story about Baldwin locomotives, which was, if you knew the US markets, the stock market in the 1910s and 1915, they were asked to justify why they were spending billions in today's money terms on a new generation of steam locomotives. in the face of the rise of the car, the motor car. And the chairman of Baldwin said, well, motor cars will never take off. There's no player, there's no infrastructure, there's no petrol stations, there's no proper roads. Cars will never take off. And he said, and there's a wiki on this, so you can look up Baldwin locomotives on wiki. He said, steam locomotives will be the dominant form of transportation well into the 1980s. That's what he said. And of course he was wrong, because technological change transformed transportation in America. And it was the rise of the motor car that dominated. I note the crossover point there of around 10% of ultimate market potential. And we saw the same in personal computing. We saw hundreds of little computer companies. You know, I'm old enough to remember a lot of these little ones, the Tandys, you know, and the Compacts and others. And we saw a very similar story. We saw sort of down to a few dominant players, and then this rapid acceleration of use of the PC as well. And are we seeing, as I believe, the same thing happening with solar? Exactly the same. History is repeating itself. Lots of little innovation, lots of little companies trying to find out the best technology for solar, and people experimenting with different devices and different ideas. And we all get one or two dominant players, and then you got this massive rise in installation of solar. And what's been the principal driver for this? What this shows you is, this is actually from Alliance Bernstein, a US brokerage. It shows you price for oil, coal, and natural gas, which are these little blue and green lines. And, you know, just 7-8 years ago, the price of solar, and you want to look at price in barrels equivalent in terms of the energy delivery, would have been way up at $200 a barrel equivalent. And just in 3-4 years, you saw this collapse in the price of the delivery of solar, which is why solar has become this powerful technology being adopted in China and India. Its price has been driving it down. Its technology change has been driving it down. You wouldn't build another coal-fired power station in Africa or other parts of the world if you can deliver the same energy cheaper and more efficiently and cleaner and safely. And it's been the price collapse of solar that's given us so much confidence, because when we heard earlier, what this graph shows you is new installations of energy from 2001 to 2013. And what you'll see is just 2 years ago, this is new installation, clean energy renewables, and it's made up of hydropower, of solar, of bioenergy, a small degree, and of wind, has now exceeded 50% of all new energy installation. It's a one-way direction. And so, you know, I'm sure you'll see this, whether you're driving through Austria or Germany, you certainly see this in the UK, is these large solar farms and parks, which are okay, fine, but in places like China and India, where you've got growing energy needs, it's household putting it on the rooftops or in microgrids or in large-scale grids, which is actually changing the nature of energy delivery in those countries. I mean, it's not just solar, it's the electric car. There's Elon Musk on the left there. He's still, you know, a young entrepreneur. And what this shows you here is his construction in the Nevada desert of an energy battery storage manufacturing plant. The oil industry said you can't really replace the combustion engine. Electric cars will never really take over. Now, there he is spending a fortune on building this new factory. He's already had $800 million of orders for his battery. Now, supposing Elon Musk got an airplane and went to Beijing, and the Chinese said, well, let's really create, let's create a real proper factory. Let's spend $5 billion on a battery storage factory. And all of a sudden, the price of batteries will drop, and we'll move from these big centralized power stations, these big nuclear or coal-fired power stations, and we'll move to a decentralized system where you'll have maybe a Tesla battery in your basement or on the ground floor of your apartment block, and you'll be using a combination of energy efficiency and solar and energy storage. And that is part of the energy revolution, which we'll also see the same with cars. And I was delighted. I was in Paris just a couple of days ago, and we just saw this row upon row of cars with their plug-in. I don't know if you have this in Vienna. Do you have this in Vienna? Well, the time will come. So history history, there are some interesting lessons from history. Now, on the left, this is Wall Street. On the left, what do you see? You just see horses and traps, and people walking along the sidewalk. 1900. People tell us you can't have an energy revolution. No, you need 30 years before you have an energy revolution. 13 years later, how many horses can you see in that picture? It's a transformation that happened, almost overnight. So as an investor, where would you like you to be? Now, you saw the technological chart. You could be a Sun Microsystem, or actually things will change, and you've got these new dominant players, the Googles, and it's a very similar story I think will happen with energy. Where would you invest your money? I want to leave it there, and I want to leave it with some kind of messages. One which is, I come as an ex-investment manager, somebody who spent many years working in finance, and what I realized is that governments, dare I say it, governments come and go. They're here for 3 years, 5 years if you're lucky, and they're short-termist in thinking. Investors will own the stock of a Mercedes-Benz, or own the stock of an Exxon. They will own that stock for 30, 40, 50 years. If you tell me where do I think the power is, I think the power is inside the banking system and the financial markets. It's when we can use that power, that transformational power, and begin to turn down the power of the fossil fuel industry, divest from the coal companies and from the oil companies that control Capitol Hill in the US, and begin to move the money into a sustainable future, that I think that we can get the safe climate outcome that we want. Thank you very much.
Do we want to watch the carbon bubble rolling down Wall Street?